Why does it feel so real when you hear it and so distant the next day? There is a moment when you listen, when everything makes sense. You feel it, not as an idea, but as a kind of inner certainty, a quiet stability, as if something inside you recognizes the truth immediately, without needing proof. And in that moment, you are not searching, you are not questioning, you are settled. But then something happens. The next day comes and the feeling is gone. Doubt returns, questions return. The old state quietly reclaims its place. And you wonder, if this is true, why doesn't it stay? That question is more important than you think, because it reveals the exact point where most people misunderstand everything. It is not that the truth disappears, it is that you leave it. And you leave it not deliberately, not consciously, but naturally, because you have spent your entire life identifying with a certain state, and that state has momentum. It feels familiar. It feels normal. So even after you touch something deeper, something truer, you drift back, not because the deeper state is weak, but because the old one is practiced. So now the issue is no longer how do I find the truth. It becomes something far more precise. How do I remain in it? Because remaining is the key, not discovering, not understanding, remaining. And this is where the idea of the divine vision becomes real, not as something mystical, not as something distant, but as something very practical, a state, a chosen inner reality that you accept as true, even before the world reflects it. So when you imagine, when you feel, when you assume, you are not creating something new, you are selecting a state. And once selected, everything depends on one thing. Do you remain or do you wander? Because the moment you wander through doubt, through reaction, through returning to appearances, you are not failing. You are simply leaving the state you chose. And when you leave it, its reflection pauses. Not because it stopped working, but because you stopped being it. So again, quietly, are you holding the vision or visiting it? Because holding is continuous. Visiting is temporary. And only what is continuous becomes real. This is why the instruction is not to try harder, not to force belief, not to eliminate doubt through effort, but to return again and again, as often as necessary. Not with frustration, not with self-judgment, but with awareness. Because every time you notice you have wandered, you are already closer than you think. Awareness means you are no longer completely lost in the old state. It means something in you is observing, recognizing, choosing again. And that choice, repeated, becomes identity. So the process is not linear. It is not a straight path from doubt to certainty. It is a movement back and forth until the new state becomes more familiar than the old one. And familiarity becomes reality. Because reality does not respond to what you touch occasionally. It responds to what you return to naturally. So if you feel peaceful during the lecture and doubtful the next day, nothing has gone wrong. You have simply returned to what feels normal. But what if you stopped accepting that as normal? What if, instead of questioning why the truth doesn't stay, you began to question why you keep leaving it? Because that shift changes everything. It moves you from being a victim of your mind to being aware of your state. And once you are aware of your state, you can choose it, not once, but continuously. And in that continuity, something stabilizes. Not instantly, but inevitably. Because whatever you remain in becomes you. And whatever becomes you becomes your world. So now the question is no longer why doubt appears, but what you do when it does. Because doubt is not the problem. Losing yourself in it is. And that distinction is subtle, but it changes everything. Because the moment you become aware that you have wandered, you are no longer completely inside the old state. Something in you has already stepped out, and that something is where your power is. Because you are not trying to eliminate doubt. You are learning not to become it. And this is where the idea of the model becomes essential. Not as a technique, but as a structure. You are always holding something within you, an image, a feeling, an assumption about yourself and your life. That is the model. And everything you experience is shaped from it. Not because the world decides it, but because your deeper being expresses it. So when you assume something not casually, but with feeling, you are not hoping it becomes real. You are giving your inner being a pattern to externalize. And that inner being does not question you. It does not argue. It simply works from what you give it, which leads to something very direct. If your model is unstable, your reality will be unstable. If your model changes constantly, your results will change constantly. Not because something is wrong, but because you are not remaining. So again, gently, what are you holding when you are not trying? Because what you hold naturally is what shapes everything. And this is why returning matters more than effort. Because effort tries to force a state temporarily. Returning establishes it permanently. Every time you come back to the chosen feeling, the chosen identity, the chosen assumption, you are not starting over. You are reinforcing, you are stabilizing, you are making it familiar. And once it becomes familiar, it becomes automatic. And once it becomes automatic, it becomes reality. This is why the instruction is so simple, but so often ignored. Return to the vision, again and again. Not just when you feel good, not just when it is easy, but especially when it seems impossible. Because that is the moment where identity is decided. Not in comfort, but in contradiction, when everything around you denies what you have assumed, and you still return to it, something deeper begins to stabilize. Not surface confidence, not false belief, but something quieter, more solid, a knowing, and that knowing does not come from repetition of words. It comes from repetition of being. So if you assume I am secure, but only feel it when things are going well, it is not yet your state. But if you return to it, even when everything suggests the opposite, it begins to take root. And once it takes root, it does not depend on circumstances anymore. It defines them. So now the process becomes very clear. Not easy, but clear. You choose a state. You feel it as real. You return to it whenever you leave it. And you do this without condemning yourself. Because condemnation only anchors you in the old state. It keeps you identified with the version of yourself that fails, that loses it, that can't stay consistent. And that identity will reproduce itself endlessly if you keep accepting it. So instead, you forgive, not as a moral act, but as a shift in identity. To forgive is to stop being the one who wanted, and to return as the one who remains. And this may happen many times, not once, not twice, but repeatedly, as often as necessary, because the number does not matter. Consistency does. So if you leave the state, return. If you doubt, return. If you react, return. Not with effort, not with struggle, but with quiet decision. Because every return strengthens the new state. And every moment you remain brings it closer to being natural. And once it is natural, you no longer need to try. You simply are. And what you are is what becomes real. And as you begin to understand this, something else quietly reveals itself. Not about technique, not about imagination, but about desire. Because not all desires come from the same place. Some are surface level, driven by comparison, habit, or fear. Others come from something deeper, something that does not shout, but calls. And if you are honest, you can feel the difference. Because there are things you want, and then there are things you think you should want. And those two are not the same. This is why chasing alone never satisfies. Because chasing is often driven by the assumption that something outside of you will complete you. More money, more success, more recognition, more of something. But even when you get it, something remains untouched. Something deeper that was never addressed. And this is where confusion begins. Because you can achieve everything you thought you wanted and still feel incomplete. Not because you failed, but because what you were chasing was not aligned with what you are. So now the question becomes more refined. What is the source of your desire? Because if it comes from lack, it will keep you in lack. If it comes from identity, it will express identity. And this is where many people unknowingly trap themselves. They try to use imagination to get things while still identifying as someone who does not have. So even their desire reinforces separation. Even their effort reinforces waiting. And reality reflects that perfectly. Not what they say, but what they are being. So again, quietly, are you desiring from completeness or from lack? Because that changes everything. If you desire from lack, you chase. If you desire from being, you express. An expression is effortless because it does not try to get anything. It simply reflects what is already assumed to be true. This is why the idea of feeling is the secret is so often misunderstood. It is not about generating emotion. It is about entering the state where something already feels real, already feels natural, already feels like this is who I am. Because once it feels like you, it no longer feels distant. And distance is what creates delay, not time, distance. So if you feel something is far away, it remains far. If you feel something is already yours, already part of you, the gap collapses. Not physically at first, but internally. And that internal collapse is what allows it to appear externally. Because again, reality does not move toward you. It unfolds from you. So the goal is not to want more intensely. It is to be more completely. And this is where desire transforms. It is no longer about getting. It becomes about expressing. Not I want this, but this is what I am. And that shift removes struggle. It removes urgency. It removes the constant feeling of needing something to change before you can feel whole. Because now wholeness comes first and everything else follows. And this is also why the text speaks about the illusion of power in the world. Because what most people call power is still dependent on something external. Money, influence, control, status. But all of that can be lost. All of that depends on conditions. But the power being described here is different. It does not depend on the world. The world depends on it. And that power is not something you gain. It is something you realize because it is already within you, already operating, already shaping your experiences, whether you are aware of it or not. So now the shift becomes deeper. You are no longer trying to use imagination to get things. You are beginning to understand that imagination is the source of everything you experience. That what you assume, what you feel, what you accept as true is constantly being expressed, not later, now. So if you continue to assume you are lacking, you will continue to experience lack. If you assume you are incomplete, you will continue to feel incomplete. But if you assume you are already what you seek, something begins to change. Not instantly in form, but immediately in identity. And identity determines everything. So now everything simplifies again. You do not chase. You choose. You do not wait. You remain. You do not try to become. You begin to be. And in that being, everything you once pursued begins to move toward you. Not because you attracted it, but because you stopped separating yourself from it. And when this begins to settle, something even more subtle reveals itself. Not about desire, not about outcomes, but about power. Not the kind of power you have been taught to recognize, but something far quieter, far more direct. Because what you call power in the world is always conditional. It depends on position, on resources, on circumstances. It can be gained and it can be lost. But there is another kind of power, one that does not depend on anything outside of you. And the moment you begin to sense it, even faintly, your entire understanding of control begins to change. Because you realize something almost impossible to accept at first. The world you experience is not moving independently of you. It appears to be, but it is not. It is responding constantly, precisely, and not to your actions, but to your inner activity. Because everything you perceive, every movement, every reaction, every event is tied to a deeper level of awareness within you. Not in a symbolic way, not in a poetic way, but in a functional way. The activity within you animates what you experience. And when that activity shifts, what you perceive must shift with it. So now, something becomes clear. You are not watching reality. You are generating it. Not consciously at first, but continuously. And this is why the idea of stopping becomes so significant. Not physically stopping the world, but becoming still within yourself. Because when you become still internally, you begin to notice something extraordinary. The constant movement of thought, reaction, interpretation begins to slow. And as it slows, your relationship with reality changes. You are no longer being pulled by it. You are observing it. And in that observation, something opens. Because now you can see the connection. You can see how your inner state precedes what you experience. How your assumptions shape your perception. How what feels natural to you becomes what appears real to you. And once you see that clearly, even briefly, something irreversible begins. You can no longer fully believe that the world is happening to you. You begin to sense that it is happening from you. So again, gently, are you reacting to what you see? Or are you aware of what you are being? Because reaction keeps you inside the illusion of separation. Awareness returns you to the source. And the source is where power exists. Not the power to control others. Not the power to manipulate circumstances. But the power to define your state. And once your state is defined, everything else follows. Because state is cause. Everything else is effect. So if your state is unstable, your experience will be unstable. If your state is reactive, your experience will reflect that reactivity. But if your state becomes still, clear, consistent, something begins to align. Not forcefully, not dramatically, but naturally. Because alignment is not something you create. It is something you allow by remaining. And this is where the idea of changing reality becomes unnecessary. Because you are no longer trying to change anything directly. You are changing the only thing that actually determines what you experience, your state of being. And once that changes, reality reorganizes itself. Not instantly in form, but inevitably in direction. Because what you are being cannot help but express itself. So now everything becomes simpler. Not easier, but clearer. You do not need to chase power. You do not need to acquire control. You do not need to force outcomes. You only need to become aware of what is already happening within you and choose it. Not once, but continuously, because continuity is what makes it real. And once it is real within you, it must become real around you, because there is no separation between the two. And when you begin to see this clearly, something else starts to loosen its grip. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly. The things that once felt necessary begin to feel optional. The things you thought you needed begin to reveal themselves as habits, not truths. Because once you understand that your state is the source, everything outside of it loses its authority. This is where one of the deepest illusions begins to dissolve. The belief that more will complete you. More money, more security, more a control, more certainty from the outside. But look closely and you will notice something. The desire for more is never satisfied, because it is not really about what you are getting. It is about what you believe you are lacking. And if that belief does not change, nothing you gain will ever feel enough. So the issue is not money. The issue is meaning, because money itself is neutral. It is a tool. But when it becomes a symbol of identity, a substitute for inner certainty, it begins to control you, not outwardly, but inwardly. It shapes what you think matters. It shapes what you chase. It shapes what you believe will finally bring you peace. And yet, peace never comes from accumulation. It comes from alignment, because alignment removes the need to chase. It removes the sense that something is missing. It removes the constant movement of trying to become more. And in that stillness, something else becomes available. Something deeper. Something that does not depend on anything external. Freedom. Not freedom from responsibility, but freedom from dependence. So now the question becomes very clear. Are you using the world, or are you depending on it? Because if you are depending on it, you will always feel unstable, always needing more, always reacting to changes, always trying to secure something that cannot be secured externally. But if you are using it from a stable inner state, everything changes. You are no longer controlled by what you have or do not have. You are no longer defined by what you gain or lose. You are no longer moved by the same urgency, because your identity is no longer tied to it. And this is where true power begins to emerge, not in controlling the world, but in no longer needing it to define you. Because the moment you no longer depend on something, you are free in relation to it. And freedom changes how you experience everything. So again, quietly, if nothing outside of you changed, could you still feel complete? Because that question reveals your state. If the answer is no, then you are still identifying with lack. If the answer is yes, even slightly, then something has already shifted. Because completeness is not something you achieve. It is something you recognize. And once recognized, it begins to stabilize. Not through effort, but through acceptance. And as it stabilizes, something surprising happens. The things you once chased begin to appear. Not because you are trying harder, but because you are no longer pushing them away through the identity of lack. Because lack repels, wholeness allows. So now everything becomes simpler again. Not in the sense that life changes immediately, but in the sense that you no longer feel the same pressure. You are no longer trying to fix everything at once. You are no longer trying to control outcomes directly. You are simply maintaining a state, and that state determines everything. So if you need money, assume it. Not as something you hope to get, but as something already natural to you. And then remain there. Not perfectly, but consistently. Because consistency is what transforms assumption into reality. And in that consistency, something deeper stabilizes. A sense of sufficiency, a sense of enoughness, a sense that you are not incomplete, even before anything changes externally. And from that place, everything begins to rearrange itself, naturally, effortlessly, in alignment with what you are now being. And as this deepens, your relationship with the body itself begins to change. Not in rejection, not in denial, but in understanding. Because up to now, you may have unconsciously identified with every reaction, every impulse, every sensation as if they were you. But something begins to separate. Not physically, but in awareness. You begin to notice there is what you are and there is what you are experiencing. And those two are not the same, because the body reacts. It follows patterns. It carries habits, impulses, tendencies built over time. It moves, it resists, it pulls you in different directions. And if you are not aware, you become it. You follow it. You identify with every movement as if it defines you. But the moment awareness increases, something shifts. You begin to observe it, and observation creates distance. Not separation in the negative sense, but clarity. Because now, instead of being carried by every impulse, you can choose whether to follow it or not. And this is where control actually begins. Not control over the world, but control over identification. Because what you identify with becomes your state, and your state becomes your reality. So if you identify with the body's reactions, fear, doubt, discomfort, urgency, those become your state. And from that state, you experience a world that reflects it. Not because the body is wrong, but because you have mistaken it for yourself. But if you begin to see the body as something you are aware of, rather than something you are, everything changes. You no longer have to eliminate reactions. You no longer have to suppress impulses. You simply stop becoming them. And that shift is freedom. Because now, even if the body reacts, you are not bound to that reaction. You can return to your chosen state. You can remain aligned with what you have assumed, regardless of what the body is doing in the moment. So again, quietly, are you the reaction or the one who sees it? Because that distinction defines everything. If you are the reaction, you are controlled. If you see the reaction, you can choose. And choice is where power lives. Not the power to change everything instantly, but the power to remain. And remaining is what stabilizes identity. Because identity is not what you feel once. It is what you return to consistently. So even when the body resists, even when doubt appears, even when discomfort rises, you do not need to fight it. You do not need to fix it. You simply return. Return to the state. Return to the assumption. Return to the feeling of being. Again and again. And every time you do, something strengthens. Not visibly at first, but internally. A new center begins to form. A place that is not moved by every external shift. A place that remains even when everything else changes. And from that place, something else becomes possible. Consistency without effort, because you are no longer trying to hold a state. You are resting in it. And when you are resting in it, the body follows. Not immediately, but inevitably, because the body reflects the state you remain in, just like the world does. So now, everything aligns. Your awareness, your identity, your experience. Not perfectly, but progressively. Because once you stop identifying with every surface reaction, you begin to stabilize at a deeper level. On that level is where creation happens. Not through action, but through being. And from that being, everything unfolds. And when this begins to stabilize, something very subtle but extremely important starts to happen. Not outside, not dramatically, but in the way you perceive time, change, and progress. Because up to now, you may have believed that results should appear quickly. That if something is working, it should be visible almost immediately. But that expectation itself comes from the old state. A state that still depends on proof. A state that still looks outward for confirmation. And as long as you remain in that pattern, you will continue to interrupt your own process. Not because anything is failing, but because you are checking too often. You are measuring too soon. You are questioning what has not yet had the chance to stabilize. Because reality does not respond to impatience. It responds to consistency. So now, the shift becomes even more refined. It is no longer just about choosing a state and returning to it. It is about trusting it without needing immediate evidence. Not blindly, not forcefully, but naturally. The way you trust something that already feels true. And this is where most people hesitate again. Because they are willing to assume, but only for a moment. They are willing to feel it, but only until the world contradicts it. And the moment contradiction appears, they leave. They return to reaction. They return to doubt. They return to the old identity. And in doing so, they reset the process. Not consciously, but inevitably. So again, gently. Are you remaining or are you checking? Because checking comes from doubt. Remaining comes from knowing. And knowing does not need constant reassurance. It does not need to look at the world and ask, is it working? Because it already is, even if you cannot see it yet. And this is where patience takes on a completely different meaning. Not waiting for something to happen, but allowing what is already set in motion to unfold. Because once you assume a state and remain in it, something begins. Not always visible, not always immediate, but real. And if you interrupt that process repeatedly, you delay it. Not because it stopped, but because you stopped. So the work becomes quieter, less about doing, more about allowing. Less about forcing belief, more about not leaving it. And this requires a different kind of discipline. Not rigid, not harsh, but steady. A willingness to remain, even when nothing seems to be happening. A willingness to stay aligned, even when appearances suggest otherwise. Because appearances are always delayed reflections. They show you what you have been, not what you are now choosing. So if you react to them, you return to the past. But if you remain in your chosen state, you move into the future. And that future begins internally first. So now everything becomes very precise. You do not measure by what you see. You measure by what you are being. You do not evaluate progress by external change. You evaluate it by internal stability. Because stability is the signal when your state no longer shifts easily, when doubt no longer pulls you away completely, when returning becomes faster, easier, more natural. You are changing, even if nothing outside confirms it yet. And that is where trust deepens. Not because you convince yourself, but because you begin to notice something undeniable. You are no longer the same. You no longer react the same way. You no longer fall as deeply into old patterns. You no longer identify with the same thoughts. And that shift is the real movement. Because once identity changes, reality must follow. Not instantly, but inevitably. So now you remain. Not because you are forcing it, but because it feels more natural than leaving. And when it feels natural, it is yours. And when it is yours, it expresses. And then, almost without noticing when it happened, everything becomes simple. Not because life has suddenly changed on the surface, but because the way you relate to it has fundamentally shifted. The urgency is gone. The tension is gone. The constant need to check, to fix, to chase begins to dissolve. And what replaces it is not excitement, but something much quieter. Sedility, a kind of inner steadiness that does not depend on what is happening around you. Because now you are no longer looking outward to define what is true. You are no longer waiting for confirmation to feel secure in your state. You are no longer asking reality to prove something to you. You are being it, and that changes everything. Because when you are being it, there is nothing to question, nothing to chase, nothing to force. The state feels natural. It feels obvious. It feels like this is just who I am. And once it feels that way, the need to maintain it disappears. Not because you lose it, but because it has become you. And when it becomes you, it becomes your world. Not as a delayed effect, but as a natural expression. Because reality does not create your state. It reflects it. And once you stop separating those two, something irreversible happens. You no longer experience life as something happening to you. You experience it as something happening from you. So now, the entire process collapses into one simple movement. Not becoming. Being. Not reaching. Remaining. Not hoping. Knowing. And this knowing is not loud. It does not need to declare itself. It does not need to convince anyone. It does not even need to convince you, because it is no longer something you are trying to hold. It is something you are resting in. And from that rest, everything unfolds, naturally, effortlessly, without resistance. So again, quietly, if nothing changed outside, would you still remain? Because that is the final distinction. If you still depend on change, you will continue to wait. If you can remain without it, you've already arrived. Because arrival is not a point in time. It is a state of being. And once you are there, time no longer matters in the same way. You are not counting days. You are not measuring progress. You are not comparing what is happening to what you expected. You are simply being. And being has no delay, because it is now, always now. So whatever you assume now, whatever you feel now, whatever you accept as true now, that is what you are. And that is what will be expressed, not because you make it happen, but because it cannot do anything else, because there is no separation between you and reality. There never was. You were never waiting for it to change. It was always waiting for you.